They said Bumpy Johnson pulled the trigger. That's the story the streets whispered. That's the story the newspapers hinted at without ever printing his name. That's the story the mob wanted people to believe because the truth was far more terrifying. The truth was that Bumpy Johnson didn't need to pull a trigger. On a cold Harlem night, when the air smelled like coal smoke and wet pavement, a man died in a narrow alley of 116th Street. The shot echoed once. Clean. Final. And every powerful man in New York's underworld knew exactly what that sound meant. It meant a line had been crossed, and it meant that Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had responded. The body belonged to a small-time Italian soldier, too ambitious, too reckless, and foolish enough to believe that Bumpy Johnson was slipping. Foolish enough to think Harlem was just another territory to be tested. Foolish enough to think Bumpy Johnson was all talk. He never even saw the man who killed him, because the trigger wasn't pulled by Bumpy Johnson. It was pulled by the man who stood 3 steps behind him at all times. His bodyguard, his shadow, his final word. And when the mob realized that Bumpy hadn't even bothered to dirty his hands, they shivered. Because that wasn't weakness. That was power refined to its purest form. By the time this happened, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was already a legend in Harlem. Not a myth, not folklore, a living, breathing authority. A man whose name carried weight from the brownstones of Sugar Hill to the back rooms of downtown Manhattan clubs, where Italian bosses whispered behind cigar smoke. He walked with a limp, earned years earlier in prison, but it only added to his presence. A reminder that he'd survived things meant to break men. A reminder that he'd paid his dues in blood, concrete, and steel bars. Bumpy Johnson wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. He dressed sharp, spoke measured, and read poetry when most men around him could barely read a room. He quoted Shakespeare and the Bible with the same calm confidence he used to negotiate numbers, territory, and lives. And Harlem respected him, not because he ruled through chaos, but because he enforced order. In an era when black neighborhoods were squeezed between racist police departments on one side and predatory criminal organizations on the other, Bumpy Johnson became something rare, a buffer. He didn't pretend to be a saint. He didn't deny the game he played. But he understood something most men in power never did. Respect wasn't taken, it was maintained. Harlem in those days was alive but fragile. Jazz poured out of clubs on Lenox Avenue. Churches stayed full. The streets buzzed with ambition, pride, and constant pressure. And hovering over it all were the Italians, organized, well-funded, and convinced that Harlem was theirs to exploit. For years, they tolerated Bumpy Johnson because he was useful, because he kept things predictable, because he understood boundaries. But tolerance is not respect, and eventually, someone always forgets the difference. The challenge didn't come from a boss. It came from someone trying to become one. A young Italian enforcer, hungry, impatient, eager to make a name, decided Bumpy Johnson was old news. That Harlem needed reminding who really controlled New York. That maybe it was time to test whether the legend still bled like everyone else. He started small. Disrespectful sit-downs, late payments, quiet interference with Harlem numbers operations, subtle enough to deny, loud enough to be heard. Bumpy noticed everything. He always did. But he said nothing. That silence made some people nervous, others mistaken. In back rooms and bars, the whispers grew. Bumpy's slowing down. Bumpy's too careful. Bumpy won't make a move unless it's personal. They were half right. It became personal when the enforcer crossed the line that Harlem never forgave. He sent a message through a third party, a message meant to humiliate. He claimed protection money on a block that Bumpy had personally kept clean for years, a block where families lived, a block where Bumpy's word had always been enough. That wasn't business. That was a challenge. And in Harlem, challenges weren't answered with words. Bumpy Johnson didn't storm into a meeting. He didn't threaten. He didn't posture. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He let his bodyguard handle it. The man's name barely appears in history books. That's intentional. Men like him weren't meant to be known. He was tall, quiet, disciplined, former military, loyal beyond reason. The kind of man who didn't ask questions because he already understood the answer. When Bumpy finally spoke, it wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it was precise. He told his bodyguard where the man would be, what time, which alley, and one more thing, spoken calmly, without emotion. Make it clean. Harlem don't need noise. That was it. No rage, no speech, no second guessing, because legends don't react. They decide. When the shot rang out that night, it didn't just end a life. It sent a message. The mob understood immediately. This wasn't a reckless act. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment killing. This was structure, delegation, control. Bumpy Johnson hadn't acted like a threatened man. He'd acted like a king enforcing a boundary. And that scared them more than any gun ever could. Because a man who pulls the trigger can be hunted, a man who doesn't need to. That man changes the rules. The streets of Harlem felt it before the papers did. The shift, the quiet, the sudden respect restored. Police patrols backed off. Italian soldiers stopped testing corners they didn't own. No celebration followed, no bragging, no confirmation. Bumpy Johnson went on with his life as if nothing had happened, which told everyone everything. This wasn't the moment Bumpy Johnson became a legend. This was the moment the world remembered why he already was. And it was only the beginning of what that single decision would unleash. The morning after the shot, Harlem woke up quieter. Not peaceful, quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in when everyone already knows what happened, but no one is foolish enough to say it out loud. Shopkeepers opened their doors with a little more caution. Numbers runners moved with their heads on a swivel. Men who had been loud the week before suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. Bumpy Johnson noticed all of it from his usual table at the Lafayette Grill. Same seat, same coffee, same calm posture. If there was guilt in him, it didn't show. If there was fear, it never surfaced. He read the paper like any other morning, eyes scanning headlines that danced around the truth without ever touching it. A shooting, unknown assailant, ongoing investigation. Bumpy folded the paper neatly when he was done. That detail mattered. He always folded it neatly. Order was important, even in chaos. Across the street, a pair of plainclothes officers watched him through a diner window, pretending not to. They'd been watching him for years. They'd never caught him doing anything wrong, and that frustrated them more than any confession ever could. Downtown, the reaction was very different. In a smoke-filled back room where Italian bosses gathered to discuss problems, the air was thick with anger and embarrassment, not grief. No one mourned a reckless soldier who didn't know his place. What they felt was insult. The young enforcer had acted without permission, But his death still landed on their ledger. It made them look weak, made them look like they'd lost control of their own people. And worse, it proved something they didn't like admitting. Bumpy Johnson was not a subordinate. He didn't even do it himself, one of the men muttered, knuckles tight around a glass. That's what makes it disrespectful. That comment hung in the room longer than it should have, because they all understood the implication. If Bumpy Johnson could order a death without ever leaving Harlem, without ever being seen, without ever being touched by law enforcement, then the balance of power wasn't what they thought it was. Still, pride is a dangerous thing among men who mistake intimidation for authority. And pride demanded a response. The mob didn't move fast. They moved careful. For weeks, nothing happened. No retaliation, no messages, no sit-down requests. On the surface, it looked like restraint, like wisdom. But underneath, pressure was building. They tightened supply lines, leaned on intermediaries, pressured independent operators who worked near Harlem's borders. Not enough to start a war, just enough to remind Bumpy that they still had reach. Bumpy felt it. He always did. But again, he said nothing. That silence started to confuse people who depended on him. Harlem businessmen, church leaders, quiet operators who relied on stability. They came to him carefully, respectfully. "Things are getting tight," one man said in a low voice. "Feels like they're squeezing," said another. Bumpy listened. He didn't reassure them with promises. He didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded. "Let them," he said. 2 words. Calm, controlled. That answer unsettled some of them more than the pressure itself. Because when Bumpy Johnson said, "let them," it meant he was waiting for something. The mob made their next mistake when they decided to escalate indirectly. They leaned on a numbers house that Bumpy didn't officially control, but everyone knew he protected. A place run by a widow who had paid faithfully and never caused trouble. The message was clear. If Bumpy wanted peace, he'd have to ask for it. That crossed the second line. And unlike the first, this one couldn't be answered quietly. Bumpy Johnson called for a sit-down, not in Harlem, not downtown, neutral ground. That alone sent a ripple through the underworld. He wasn't asking permission, he was setting terms. When the representatives arrived, 2 capos and a lawyer, they expected posture, threats, negotiation. What they got instead was something far more unsettling. Bumpy Johnson didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't deny anything. He sat back, hands folded, and listened while they spoke about misunderstandings and disruptions and mutual interests. When they finished, he waited a full 5 seconds before responding. That silence was intentional. "You sent a boy to test me," Bumpy said evenly. He failed. No accusation, no denial, just fact. One of the men shifted in his chair. "That situation was unfortunate," he said carefully. Bumpy leaned forward slightly. "No," he replied. "It was instructional." That word landed hard. Instructional meant deliberate. Instructional meant finished. They tried to salvage dignity. They spoke of structure, of hierarchy, of consequences. That's when Bumpy Johnson said the thing that would be repeated for years afterward. Never quoted directly, never written down, but remembered word for word by the men in that room. "I don't answer to chaos," he told them, "and I don't answer to men who can't control their own house." The lawyer started to interject. Bumpy raised a single finger. The room went silent. "You want peace," he continued. then stopped mistaking patience for permission. There was no threat in his voice. That was the threat. The sit-down ended without agreement. No handshakes, no smiles, just clarity. From that moment on, everyone understood that the next move would define the future, not just for Harlem, but for how power was negotiated across the city. If the mob pushed, it would be war. If they backed down, it would be public. And neither option sat well with men who had built their reputations on never yielding. Back in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson walked the streets that evening like he always did. Slowly, deliberately, a nod here, a brief word there. His bodyguard followed 3 steps behind him, eyes alert, posture calm. They passed the block where the widow's Numbers house stood. The lights were back on. Business had resumed. No announcement had been made. But the message was already moving faster than words ever could. Bumpy Johnson hadn't pulled the trigger, but he had pulled the city back into alignment. And everyone, friends and enemies alike, knew the next confrontation wouldn't be subtle. It would be definitive. Power never announces itself when it's real. It moves quietly, like pressure building behind a wall. And in the days following that sit-down, New York felt that pressure everywhere. Harlem breathed easier, but downtown did not. The mob's restraint was no longer strategic. It was calculated survival. They knew a public war with Bumpy Johnson would expose something they had spent decades hiding. That their grip on the city was no longer absolute. But knowing that truth didn't make swallowing it any easier. So they searched for another way. The move came from an unexpected place. Not a gun, not a threat, not even a message. It came through the courts. A federal investigation was quietly reopened. Old names, old files, old charges that had never quite stuck the first time. Prosecutors dusted off paperwork and convinced themselves they were close, closer than they'd ever been. Someone had whispered in the right ear. Someone had decided that if Bumpy Johnson couldn't be beaten in the streets, he'd be buried in procedure. Bumpy knew the moment the pressure shifted. He felt it in the way certain phones stopped ringing, in how a few associates suddenly remembered appointments they'd forgotten to mention, in the way cops started showing up where they didn't belong, not aggressive, just present. Observation was the first step. He welcomed it. At home, Bumpy prepared the way he always did when trouble circled, with discipline. Books lined the walls: philosophy, poetry, history, Marcus Aurelius, Shakespeare, Du Bois. He read every night, not because he needed distraction, but because understanding power required understanding people. And people, he knew, always followed patterns. The mob believed law enforcement could do what they could not. Law enforcement believed the mob would finally give them leverage. Both sides were wrong about one thing. Bumpy Johnson had already survived this game. The arrest came early in the morning. No violence, no chaos, just a knock and a warrant. He dressed carefully, adjusted his tie, said nothing as the cuffs closed around his wrists. Outside, neighbors watched from windows and doorways. Some whispered, some prayed, others just stared. They had seen this before, and they had seen what usually followed. Downtown newspapers treated it like a victory. Headlines spoke of major breakthroughs and long-awaited justice. Politicians smiled into cameras and spoke about order and law. But Harlem didn't celebrate. Harlem waited. Because the people who actually understood power knew something the headlines didn't. If Bumpy Johnson had fallen, they would have known already. Inside the holding cell, Bumpy sat quietly, hands folded in his lap, eyes steady. Detectives came and went, testing angles, fishing for cracks. They offered deals without calling them deals. They hinted at protection without promising safety. They wanted him to speak. He didn't. Silence was his most dangerous weapon. While the city focused on the arrest, something else happened beneath the surface. Numbers' houses reopened with new confidence. Disputes that had lingered suddenly resolved themselves. Men who had been hesitant started moving again. Nothing reckless, nothing loud, just order returning. That's when the mob realized the truth they had been avoiding. Bumpy Johnson was not a king who ruled from a throne. He was a system, and systems don't disappear when you remove one piece. The trial was scheduled quickly. Too quickly. That was the second mistake. Evidence was thin. Witnesses were unreliable. Timelines didn't align. And the few men willing to talk suddenly remembered things differently than they had before. Fear changes memory. Loyalty erodes it. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was full, not with chaos, but with presence. Community leaders, quiet businessmen, men who never sat in courtrooms unless something truly mattered. The judge noticed. So did the prosecutors. So did the mob's representatives watching from the back, realizing too late that this had become something bigger than a case. This was a test, and tests reveal weakness. When Bumpy finally spoke, it wasn't in defense, it was in clarification. "I've lived long enough to know," he said calmly. "The truth doesn't rush. It waits." No grand speech, no drama, just certainty. The charges didn't collapse that day. They simply failed to stand. Delays followed, motions stalled, witnesses disappeared into safer versions of their lives. Weeks passed, then months, and eventually, quietly, without fanfare, Bumpy Johnson walked free. No parade, no statement, just another morning in Harlem. The mob never pushed again. They adjusted. They negotiated. They retreated without admitting it. Because they understood now what the city had always known. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to dominate New York. He only needed to remain unmovable. Freedom didn't change Bumpy Johnson. It confirmed him. When he walked back into Harlem, there was no celebration waiting, no cheers, no music spilling into the streets, just doors opening quietly, heads nodding, eyes following him with the same look they always had. Respect without noise. That kind of respect is rare. And it doesn't come from fear. It comes from consistency. By the late 1950s, Harlem was no longer just a neighborhood fighting for survival. It had become a battleground of ideas. Civil rights meetings filled basements and backrooms. Young men spoke with fire about dignity, equality, and liberation. Old men listened carefully, knowing that fire could warm a house or burn it down. Bumpy Johnson watched it all from a distance, not because he didn't care, because he understood timing. That's when Malcolm X entered the picture. Malcolm was different from the leaders Harlem had seen before. He didn't ask politely. He didn't soften his words for comfort. He spoke with a sharp edge of truth. And that made him dangerous to enemies and allies alike. He drew crowds. He drew attention. And attention in Harlem always came with consequences. Malcolm knew it, which is why he sought Bumpy Johnson out. Their meeting didn't happen in public. It happened the way serious conversations always did in Harlem, quietly behind closed doors, with no witnesses who talked. Two men sat across from each other. One controlled the streets, The other commanded minds. Both understood power. Bumpy listened more than he spoke. Malcolm talked about dignity, about how black men were tired of being told to wait, about how respect wasn't something given, it was something taken back. Bumpy didn't interrupt. When Malcolm finished, Bumpy leaned back and studied him. "You're right," he said finally, "but you're also visible." Malcolm smiled faintly. He already knew that was the problem. From that moment on, something unspoken formed between them. Bumpy Johnson never joined the movement publicly, never stood at podiums, never gave speeches. He didn't need to. What he did instead was ensure something far more valuable: safety. Meetings went uninterrupted. Harassment eased. Men who might have caused trouble found better places to be. No announcements were made, no warnings were issued, but everyone understood. Harlem's most visible voice would not be silenced on Bumpy Johnson's watch. The mob noticed. They always did. They didn't like politics mixing with street order. It attracted federal attention, unpredictable energy, young men who didn't understand the rules. But they didn't interfere, not after what they'd already learned. Police noticed too. Stops around certain buildings decreased. Raids lost urgency. Patrol patterns changed, not because of orders, because of caution. No one wanted to be responsible for setting something off they couldn't control. Malcolm trusted Bumpy for one reason above all else. Bumpy didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. He never called himself righteous, never claimed innocence. He understood the street and its costs, and he never lied about either. That honesty mattered. When Malcolm was assassinated years later, Harlem didn't explode. It mourned. And beneath that mourning was a quiet fury that never needed instruction. Bumpy Johnson didn't retaliate. He didn't speak publicly. But the neighborhood closed ranks in a way outsiders couldn't understand. Order held, respect held. That alone was a statement. By then, Bumpy's legend had outgrown crime stories and courtroom rumors. He had become something else entirely. A stabilizer. A man who knew where the line was and never crossed it without reason. Young hustlers still came looking for guidance. Bumpy gave them books, poetry, history. He told them power without discipline was just noise. Most didn't listen. The ones who did survived longer. The mob never challenged him again directly. They adapted their business away from Harlem, quietly, strategically. Retreat dressed up as cooperation. Because legends don't need to win every fight. They just need to make fighting them pointless. As the years passed, Bumpy Johnson aged, but his presence didn't fade. He walked slower, spoke softer. But when he entered a room, conversations still paused. That kind of silence can't be bought. It has to be earned. And Harlem remembered. Not the gunshots, not the rumors, but the balance. The fact that under Bumpy Johnson, the neighborhood stood taller, spoke louder, and bowed to no one who didn't deserve it. By the mid-1960s, Harlem had changed, but not as much as outsiders thought. The faces were younger, the slogans louder, the pressure heavier. But power still respected structure, and Bumpy Johnson was structure. Age didn't weaken him. It clarified him. Bumpy no longer needed to raise his voice. He rarely left Harlem now. His world had narrowed to familiar streets, trusted faces, and a handful of quiet rooms where decisions still mattered. Men still came to him for approval. Not permission. Approval. The mob had learned long ago that Harlem was not worth the cost. They made money elsewhere. Safer places, cleaner operations. But they never stopped watching Bumpy. Because legends don't retire. They linger. Inside Harlem, a new problem was growing. Young men with no memory, no patience, no understanding of what restraint had saved them from. They carried guns without history, talked about power without knowing its weight. They didn't fear consequences because they didn't understand them yet. Bumpy saw it coming. The streets always tell you before the newspapers do. He tried to warn them, not with threats, with truth. You think fear keeps people in line, he told one young crew leader. Fear only works until somebody stops being afraid. The kid laughed. Bumpy didn't. That was the difference between generations. One learned from survival, the other learned from bravado. Still, even the reckless respected boundaries. No one moved against Bumpy. No one tested him directly. Because every story they'd heard ended the same way. The man who underestimated him didn't finish well. Then came the betrayal. Not violent, not dramatic, just quiet and familiar. The most dangerous kind. Someone close, someone trusted, started talking, not to police directly, to people who talk to people. Small details, casual mentions, locations, schedules, nothing actionable on its own. But together, a pattern. Bumpy felt it before he confirmed it. The air changed, meetings shortened, people hesitated before answering. That hesitation told him everything. He didn't confront the man immediately. He watched, listened. Let the truth finish revealing itself. That was always his way. When the confrontation finally came, it wasn't explosive. It was devastating. Two men sat across from each other, just like so many times before. Bumpy didn't accuse. He asked one question. Why? The answer didn't matter, because excuses don't undo choices. The man expected anger, threats, violence. He didn't get any of it. Bumpy stood, straightened his coat and said, "You're done." That was all. The man wasn't harmed, wasn't chased, wasn't punished publicly. He was simply erased from conversations, from rooms, from relevance. In Harlem, that was worse than violence. Word spread quickly. Not about betrayal, about consequence, and order returned. But time was catching up to Bumpy Johnson. His heart wasn't what it used to be. Doctors warned him, friends worried, enemies waited. On July 7th, 1968, Bumpy Johnson collapsed while eating at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. No gunshots, no sirens, just a man slumping forward quietly among his people. A heart attack. The only thing that ever took him without permission. News spread faster than anyone expected. Harlem stopped. Literally. Shops closed early. Streets filled. Men who'd never spoken his name out loud bowed their heads. Women cried openly, not because he was perfect, but because he was theirs. The mob took notice. So did law enforcement. So did politicians. All of them understood the same thing at the same time. An era had ended. Bumpy Johnson was buried with dignity. No spectacle, no myth-making, just respect. The real kind. History tried to simplify him. That was its first mistake. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson did not fit neatly into any category America preferred. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't a movie character. He was something far more uncomfortable to explain. He was a man who operated inside an unjust system and forced that system to negotiate with him. And that made people uneasy. After his death, outsiders rushed to define him. The newspapers called him a crime boss. Law enforcement labeled him a syndicate figure. Hollywood eventually turned him into a character. But Harlem remembered something else entirely. They remembered balance. Bumpy Johnson had lived through eras when Harlem was treated as expendable by politicians, by police, by organized crime, by the city itself. He understood that respect was never offered freely to black communities in America. It had to be demanded and sometimes enforced. What separated Bumpy from the chaos around him was not violence, it was restraint. He knew when force ended problems and when it multiplied them. He knew when silence was stronger than speech. And he understood something most powerful men never learned. Fear creates obedience. Respect creates stability. That philosophy shaped how Harlem functioned for decades. Under Bumpy's influence, chaos had boundaries. Exploitation had limits. Outsiders, whether mobsters or politicians, understood that Harlem was not an open market to be stripped and discarded. It was defended, not by law, but by consequence. His relationship with the Italian mafia was the clearest proof of his unique position. The mob did not respect weakness. They respected leverage. And Bumpy had it. Not just muscle, but intellect. Not just territory, but unity. He spoke their language without surrendering his own identity. He negotiated without submission. He drew lines without apology. That was why the mob never truly conquered Harlem. They calculated the cost and decided it wasn't worth paying. The bodyguard who pulled the trigger that night, the moment that made the mafia shiver, was not acting alone. That's what history often misses. It wasn't about one bullet. It was about the understanding behind it. Everyone involved knew the same truth. Touching Bumpy Johnson directly meant consequences that would not end cleanly. So they learned, and they adapted, and Harlem remained standing. But Bumpy's greatest legacy wasn't criminal. It was communal. He funded education quietly, supported families silently, settled disputes before they became funerals, protected voices that would later shape civil rights movements. Even Malcolm X understood this. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a revolutionary in speeches. He was a revolutionary in structure. When Bumpy died, the vacuum he left was immediate and dangerous. Without his restraint, the streets grew louder, more reckless, more fragmented. The balance he maintained collapsed slowly, but inevitably. That collapse proved something important. Bumpy Johnson wasn't replaceable. Because he wasn't just powerful. He was intentional. Years later, historians would argue over him. Academics would debate morality. Filmmakers would dramatize his life. But Harlem never argued. They remembered the nights without fear, the streets that stayed intact, the outsiders who knew better than to overstep. Legends aren't defined by perfection. They're defined by impact. And Bumpy Johnson's impact still echoes through Harlem streets, long after the gunshots stopped, long after the deals ended, long after the city moved on. This wasn't the story of a man who pulled the trigger. It was the story of a man who didn't have to. Because real power doesn't announce itself. It waits.